Thank you so much, Dr. LaMarche, and my warm thanks to Dr. Riekman also to both of them for organizing this event and all of the staff who've been supporting it. It's really wonderful that we're doing something like this at Life University, and I've really appreciated hearing all the talks thus far. Since you've already heard so many great talks, I think I'm going to skip mine and just not try and follow those acts. I really appreciate also just even being able to be in the audience and hear that talk. The talk that Richard just gave, I don't know how many times I've heard him talk. It might be 10 or 12 or more times, but every time it's an extremely powerful experience, and it was again that time to hear about someone talking about basic human values like forgiveness from that place of deep personal experience. It's remarkable. What I'd like to talk about is some of the science and research around these values like compassion and forgiveness. How there are some shifts that are taking place in a variety of different disciplines, from neuroscience to psychology, different areas of neuroscience like social and affective neuroscience, different areas of psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology, clinical psychology, and even fields like primatology and other disciplines, contemplative research, the scientific study of meditation, which are all starting to shift our view of human nature and of these values in what I think is a very positive way. And what I mean by that is that we've had a view of human nature that's dominated I believe dominated in Western thought and certainly dominated in the sciences, that's viewed us as primarily individuals and primarily self-centered individuals. Individuals who basically have to look out for themselves because that's our evolutionary past. It's survival of the fittest, for example. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. And basically I have to be concerned for me and mine first, and then afterwards I can think about my relationships to other people. So things like compassion and forgiveness, gratitude, prosociality, these are things that we've never really seen as being at the core of who we are, at the deepest parts of who we are. So people have even said that ideas like equality and fairness and justice, these are all things that only arose in the 18th century with things like the French Revolution. You know, these are modern concepts, these are new concepts. These are things that never existed in nature, they never existed in our past. It was just sheer kind of brute force back then. But we're now realizing that that picture of human nature is quite skewed. And it's potentially also quite damaging if we accept that. Because what we realize now is both in terms of our evolutionary past, so thinking back in time, thousands, tens of thousands of years, and in terms of our developmental course, so from birth to old age, care and compassion are things that are absolutely central to our survival. They're not peripheral. They're at the core of who we are, both in terms of our physical and our psychological development. Our sense of consciousness, our brain, the way our brain develops, the way our immune system and physiology develops, we realize even the way our genes get expressed epigenetically, they all change according to whether we feel we're receiving care for others or not. Just physical sustenance, food, water, shelter, is not enough for us to develop as a healthy human being with healthy brains, a healthy immune system, and so on. And the evidence for this is mounting and is extremely convincing now from a variety of different fields. So one of the interesting perspectives on this is that it really shouldn't be so surprising, there we go, because care, and particularly maternal care, goes back very, very far in our evolutionary history. So there's one thing that all bird and mammal species have in common, and that is that we require maternal care to survive. So if we are a bird or a monkey or an ape or a human being or a squirrel or a mouse or a cat or a rat or anything like that, we don't belong to a species where our mother can just give birth to us and then take off, and then we're just going to be fine on our own. If we're any member of a bird or mammal species, if our mother gives birth to us and takes off, we die. And not only that, if our mother even doesn't take cares for us for a brief amount of period and then leaves, then we die or we don't develop properly. So what this means is that, at least tracing back to the last common ancestor of birds and mammals, care has become an absolute criterion for survival. And then in the development of our species and the development of other mammalian and bird species, what happens is that our very brains and physiology then become dependent on that care. So what's interesting, if that's true, what's interesting is what we should find is not these theories of these intellectuals saying that fairness and cooperation and care and consideration are things that only emerged in the 18th century, or maybe we could go back 2,000 years and maybe the Greeks had something to say about it. It's still relatively recent evolutionarily. But rather we would expect to see that these go back very far in our evolutionary history and therefore are common and can be found in other mammalian and bird species. And that is exactly what we found. What we found is that when we study non-human primates or monkeys, for example, we see that cooperation, fairness, targeted helping, consolation, all these types of behaviors are actually readily available for us to study. So when chimps get into a fight and a bigger chimp, the alpha, beats up on the smaller chimp, that chimp is off, crying somewhere. After the fight, another chimp will go over and put his arm around the chimp and console it. One of the interesting things about rats is if you stress out a rat, by doing, and I don't do any experiments like this, I do very nice experiments, but you can stress out a rat by giving him like electric shocks at random times, and he gets really, really stressed out. And you put another rat in there, a smaller rat, and the bigger rat, if he doesn't know the smaller rat, is going to go over and bite him. And when he bites him, he actually relaxes. It's a stress reliever. So, you see somebody kind of really upset and dysregulated, and they look at somebody, they're looking around for somebody to take it out on, and they take it out on that person, and they feel better afterwards, right? So that even happens in rats. But if you put in another rat, you stress out the big rat, but then you put in another rat that this rat does know as part of his in-group, then they can do something else. They can start grooming each other. And that also relieves stress and doesn't perpetuate that cycle of stress and violence. So what this means is that these types of behaviors, which we consider to be the foundation of moral and ethical behavior, consideration for others, empathy, targeted helping, consolation, fairness, these are things that are common not even just to human beings. And if that's true, then they're very ancient in us evolutionarily, and that means that it makes sense that they would be very deep in our psyches and in our bodies. So I don't have time to show you this video, but I encourage you to go online if you haven't seen it and just type in Capuchin monkey cooperation experiment or fairness experiment. Capuchin fairness experiment, it'll come up. And my favorite one is one where there are these two cute monkeys trying to open a little can of nuts, and you see them cooperate. And what's interesting is they're separated by a cage, so the one who can actually, they have to cooperate to open the nuts. But then the one on one side of the cage, he gets all the nuts. He gets 6 nuts, right? So he needed the help of the other monkey to get into these nuts. But once he's got the nuts, he's sitting there with his 6 nuts, and the other monkey's on the other side of the cage, and there's a little porthole, but you would expect that he'd just sit there and eat all 6 nuts. But he doesn't. Before he starts eating, he takes 3 of the nuts, and he passes them through the hole to the other monkey. And this is inexplicable behavior, not just to psychologists, but also especially to economists, who don't believe that even humans should really act this way, much less capuchin monkeys. There's another interesting experiment that you'll see if you watch this video, which is 2 capuchins playing a game with a human, and the human gives them a chip, the capuchin gives the chip back. That's all the task is. And the human then gives the capuchin a little nut. And the monkey eats the nut and he's very happy. And then you can play this game with capuchins all day long, and they'll just keep giving you those chips back and keep getting their nuts, and they happily eat their nuts. But then what happens is the experimenter, instead of giving a nut, gives a grape to one of the monkeys. And the other monkey sees that. And grapes are better than nuts. They have a lot more sugar. And capuchins are like us. They like sugar. So apparently we shouldn't eat too much sugar, I learned today. But capuchins don't know that. They want lots of sugar. So the first capuchin sees, he's like, I got a nut. Wait, that guy got a grape. So then, the experimenter gives the chip to the capuchin. The capuchin gives it back, and he's expecting a grape too now, right? Because that guy got a grape. And he gets a nut. And he just looks at the nut, and he's confused. He doesn't eat the nut. He gives the nut back, and he plays the game again, and he gets another nut. And he says, what? And he throws the nut away. And he plays the game again, and he says, and now he's not even looking at the nut, he's not even going to take it. And he starts, climbing over the experimenter, trying to pry his hand open. Where's the grape? I deserve a grape. And in the video that you'll see, if you watch the one with which kind of has a fellow with a British accent narrating it, you'll see that the experimenter is nice, and he eventually gives the capuchin a grape. But some of my colleagues have run this replications of this experiment, and I've seen their videos, and they're a little less nice. They don't give the grape, so they just keep doing this, and eventually the capuchin just storms off and refuses to interact with the experimenter at all. So what's fascinating is that even monkeys have a sense of what is fair, what's fair play, right? And so a kind of primitive sense of what justice should be about. And that's fascinating, because that means that when we tap into something, Richard talked about justice, when we tap into basic aspects of justice and equality, we're not tapping into some kind of higher order cognitive process. We're tapping into something that's very, very deep within us, very deep within our hearts and bodies. Now, so what I'm suggesting, the implications of this is that we're moving from a model in psychology, neuroscience, and some of the social sciences from viewing human beings as essentially individuals who then choose to come into relationship with others, right? This was, an idea that was popularized by people like, very smart people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is that society is a social contract. So basically, we could live on our own, but we decide to come into relationships with other people because we can, benefit more from that way. And this is an economist's view of human nature too, right? Is basically we're independent individuals, but I can kind of barter with you and then we're both better off, right? That's one view of human nature. We're moving towards another view where we're actually born into social connections. We're born into connections of care, especially with our parents, for example, and our communities. And if we don't receive that care, we don't even survive, much less develop properly. So care and social connection is a fundamental part of who we are. And that means we need to rethink our approach to a lot of different things. Richard joked that, because he's blind, he doesn't have to see all of you. And it's a funny joke. But there's also, as with a lot of funny jokes, there's a grain of truth in that. Because when we survey people, for example, and ask, what's the #1 thing people are afraid of? What do they say? Public speaking, yeah. Public speaking comes in #1. And what's #2? Death. So this doesn't make any sense. I remember the first time I heard this was a while back. I thought, this is crazy. How could someone fear public speaking more than death? That doesn't make any sense. But if the perspective that I'm proposing is right, then it makes sense, because sociality, right, our social life is just as important, if not more important, than our physical life. So rejection by your peers, rejection by other people, this isn't some superficial thing. This is getting at the heart of who we are. And we see this in a very sad way when we look at statistics on suicide. Because suicide, which can take place for many different reasons, sometimes takes place because someone is choosing physical death over social death. Right? They're actually considering that their social life is more important than their physical life. So if someone's bullied, if someone is being harassed, and they reach a point where they can't take it anymore, or they're so filled with fear or the actual experience of rejection, and they decide to take their own life, then they're choosing physical death over social death. And again, that's not the only reason why people commit suicide, of course, but there was a case of a university student, for example, who was outed by his roommate for being gay, and his roommate posted photos and videos on Facebook, and then his roommate committed suicide. So in cases like that, someone's choosing physical death over social death. And when we look at statistics on suicide, we see that groups that are at more risk for social exclusion or social isolation or social rejection have much higher rates of attempted suicide. So people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual have attempted suicide rates that are 2 to 4 times higher, those who don't. people who self-identify as transgender have suicide rates of 70 to 200 times that are higher than those who don't. And this just shows the cost of social rejection and a lack of feeling care and compassion from your community. So I'm not going to read all these quotes, but a lot of intelligent people have talked about the importance of love and compassion. Here's His Holiness saying that these are not mere luxuries. They're the sources of internal and external peace, and they're fundamental to the continued survival of our species. They're the very thing that gives meaning to our activities, right? If my activities, don't have any impact on other people, how meaningful in the end are they going to be to me? If my activities, like the activities Richard just shared, the work that children in Crossfire are doing, if my activities are impacting the lives of other people in a beneficial way, that brings tremendous sense of meaning to my life. I feel like my life has purpose and has meaning. And so we have a lot of people out there telling us, how to have meaning, how to have purpose in your life. If there's no sense of social connection there, in the meaning or purpose that you're generating in your life, I'm not sure how deep that meaning is going to be, because it's not connecting to yourself on the deepest level. Einstein, this is part of a beautiful letter that Einstein wrote to a rabbi who had written to him, because the rabbi had a parishioner or a member of his synagogue who had lost a child. And that parishioner went to the rabbi and said, why would God do this? And, why would God take my child away? And the rabbi didn't know what to say. And the rabbi, as many people did during Einstein's time, wrote to Einstein for advice. And it wasn't advice on the theory of relativity or physics. It was on this very important personal question. And Einstein said that our greatest task must be to free ourselves from the prison of self-centeredness, of an independent self, to expand our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature. And Darwin himself, who gets blamed for this whole idea of survival of the fittest, which is a phrase Darwin himself never used, said that the greatest kind of moral acquisition that we have as human beings is our ability to extend our sympathy beyond our in-group and out-group. So even though compassionate care is something that we share with all bird and mammal species, what's unique to us as human beings is that we can use our minds to expand that sense of compassion out, so that it's not just my family, my group, or even my species, but it's all of humanity. It's all of nature, it's all of species. That's a capacity that most animals don't have, right? Certainly not to the extent that we have. And that's remarkable, but we have to use it. So one of the questions is, if compassion and care, forgiveness, and these values are so deeply a part of us, that wouldn't be that meaningful if we couldn't actually train them. If we were just, say, born with a certain amount of forgiveness, So one of the pressing questions we have is compassion, is forgiveness, is gratitude something that we can actually cultivate as a skill? Can we increase our level of compassion? And what's great is that here we've also seen a real revolution in psychology and the neurosciences, away from a view that the adult brain is kind of pretty much static, doesn't grow new neurons, doesn't change its structure, doesn't change its function in any significant way, towards ideas of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Throughout the 20th century, people actually lost their jobs. Neuroscientists actually lost their jobs and lost grants and left universities for proposing the ideas of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And it's only about 20 years ago that the field actually recognized that they were right all along. So we continue to grow new neurons all the way up until the last day that we die. We're growing hundreds of new neurons. We can quite significantly restructure our brain structure and function through intentional practice. And that's given rise to a whole field called contemplative science, which is the scientific study of meditation. And this is something we study here at Life University, and we now actually have one of the only master's programs in the world, actually the only master's program in the world, that combines positive psychology and contemplative science. And it's also one of the only master's programs in the world that looks at either of those two. So a lot of people see meditation like this, they think of it as something kind of very spiritual and holy. I'll describe it for Richard's sake. It's a beautiful woman on a lake. She seems to be floating on the surface of a lake, and she's kind of looking up, and she has her hands out open, and she's in a kind of very relaxing looking garment. It looks very spiritual. And much to the chagrin of my students, I see meditation as this. It's hard work. It takes practice. And this is a picture of a brain lifting weights. Meditation is about actually trying to put into practice our values. So if you hear an inspirational talk on forgiveness, like Richard's, what that should suggest to you is not just that forgiveness is an amazing thing, but also, well, is that something I could cultivate? If I put it into practice in my life, could I cultivate it? And I want to show you some slides that suggest that we absolutely can, and we can even measure the differences in our brains, in our behavior, and so forth, and in our physiology when we do actually put this into practice. So some of the research I've very much had the good fortune of being part of is research on a protocol called cognitively based compassion training, which was developed by a teacher of mine, Dr. Lobsang Tenzin Negi. And what Dr. Negi did was he took a Tibetan Buddhist protocol for cultivating compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, and love, and he secularized it so that someone of any religion or no religion could practice it. And what CBCT recognizes is that we have this biological basis for compassion, but if we intentionally cultivate it using all our human intelligence, our resources, our critical thinking, and practice it on a daily or at least 2 or 3 times a week basis, that we can actually cultivate and expand that sense of compassion and forgiveness. So I've been engaged in doing research on CBCT for the past 10 years. We're doing research like that here at Life too, particularly in an elementary school at the moment. And these are some of the steps, the key steps of CBCT. Going through a very ordered, progressive series of steps in order to arrive at greater compassion and forgiveness. First, training the mind in intentional stability, then developing self-compassion, which is your examination of what is going to bring you happiness and what's going to hold you back and bring you suffering. So when Richard said that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, whereas anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? That's, from the perspective of CBCT and self-compassion, we'd say that's recognizing that forgiveness is something that's going to bring you happiness. It's a gift. It's going to bring you greater joy and peace of mind. So that's something to cultivate, whereas anger is only going to hold you back. Anger and resentment are going to hold you back. That's something to weaken and distance yourself from. And the practice is basically just about recognizing that and then practicing that in your life through meditation, but not just sitting down as that woman was, but also when you're going around and watching for anger, watching for resentment, looking for opportunities for forgiveness. And then extending that to others through impartiality, affectionate love and empathy, and then ultimately compassion. So we do this research with a variety of different groups. We do it with kids. When we teach it with kids, we try to get them to participate in terms of arts. So these are children kind of, trying to draw what would a meditative state be like. It's not like being crazy and jumping all over the place, but it's also not falling asleep. So if any of you think meditation means taking a nap, there are some 5-year-old kids in Georgia who know better than you. It's not about that. It's about having this calm, focused state of mind. We also talk about self-compassion. Well, it's not just about, anger and things like that, resentment. They're not things that just come out of nowhere. They can start with just a spark. And that spark, then, if it doesn't get caught, turns into a forest fire. So if we're talking about self-compassion, protecting ourselves, it means recognizing those destructive emotions, what Richard called the self-destruct emotions, right? Recognizing them when they're just sparks before they become a forest fire and before they wreak havoc in our lives. One of the populations that we're starting to work with here at Life is a prison population. And I've also taught CBCT in prisons to inmates. This is something they understand very, very well. You don't need to spend hours explaining this to them because they're all inside because a spark led to a forest fire. And then the consequences could be 20 years, 30 years, life, or even death. meditating about things like interdependence, how everything that we have, that we rely on, that we need, comes from others. Even the idea of a sweater, right? And we do this with children too, draw a sweater in the middle of a big piece of paper. Everything that comes from that sweater. You could do this with anything, your clothing, anything you eat, right? This event here, everything that went into making this event possible. How many people did it take to make this event possible? If I don't think about that very seriously, then I just think, Gilles, he did it all. That's obviously not true, and it's probably offensive to many of you if I were to say that. He had a lot of support, right, from many of you here in this room. And you all had support, right? And there are people that support you, not even here at work, but the people who prepare the food that you eat, right? Your families, the people who taught you, your mentors, all the people throughout your life. All those people went into making this possible so we could be here together and benefit from each other's thoughts and experiences, right? But we don't think in that way. If I just think on the surface, I just see Gilles. So I have to meditate a little bit. I have to think a little bit deeper. And then I see thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, millions of people. Now, interestingly enough, kids get this much faster than adults. They get it like this. You know, you ask them, when does this web of interdependence end? It never ends. That's their instantaneous answer. And it may be because children still existing in that place where they're dependent, where they need care. Richard talked about how he depends on the help of others. So he doesn't forget, but we forget sometimes, right? I think, you know, well, I could get on the stage by myself. So I think, I don't need anybody. I'm fine, right? And that's a delusion. That's the delusion that Einstein called the prison of our consciousness. It's just not true. But we need to reflect and we need to meditate on that, and we can. So just a few slides on what happens when people do engage in these practices for as little as 3 times a week, 8 weeks. Well, one of the most remarkable responses that my colleagues and I have found is that, these are undergraduate students, is that when you look at things like inflammation, things that we know are not good for the body, running around with high levels of inflammation associated with almost every chronic illness and condition that's out there, is that just practicing CBCT for 3 times a week, 8 weeks, that's this high meditation group, right? They come into a stress test, they come into a lab and then go through a stress test, that's what the TSST stands for. They come in running cooler, lower levels of inflammation. They go through the stress test and they come out, again, cooler than the control condition, but also cooler and therefore healthier than the people who went through the meditation class but didn't meditate much. So you're here at LifeTalks and you've heard some great talks, but if you don't put this into practice in your life, then according to this study at least, and some of our other studies, you're just in the same boat as somebody who never came to LifeTalks, right? So putting it into practice, this is absolutely important. But what about their own subjective experience? Well, they're coming into the lab reporting lower levels of distress. And even after the stress test, amazingly, where we're trying our best to stress them out by making them give talks, for example, and do complicated math problems and kind of putting them in situations where they might make a fool of themselves, all in the name of science, of course. They're reporting being calmer, and even after they've been stressed out, they're actually calmer than the other kids were even before they came in. What about what this does to the brain? So are we actually becoming more compassionate, more empathetic by practicing these things? Well, here's this was done by a doctoral student who was a part of our group, and she did her Ph.D. in neuroscience on this study. Jenny Mascaro is her name, a brilliant young scientist. What she found is that through neuroimaging was that people who went through CBCT compared to the control group and people who practiced in the CBCT group showed stronger activation in parts of the brain during an empathic accuracy test than controls, and particularly in those areas that we believe are part of the mirror neuron network. So the mirror neuron network is a fascinating network that's just recently been discovered, which is that when we see another person engage in an intentional action, part of our brain activates as if we were doing the same action. So you see somebody pick up a glass of water and drink it, and part of your brain activates as if you were picking up a glass of water and drinking it. So this shows that empathy is something that's actually wired into our brains, and it's amazing. And it's probably the reason why, when you go to a movie, you enjoy the movie. There's a car chase scene and you get excited because part of you is simulating as if you were in that car chase scene, right? Otherwise, movies would be pretty boring, and that would be bad. So it's good that we have this, and we probably we wouldn't even have empathy if we didn't have this. So what's interesting is in areas like the inferior frontal gyrus and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, we saw stronger activation in people who practice CBCT. So it's almost as if the brain is a set of muscles, you're exercising those muscles, and the muscle strength is getting stronger. What's interesting, this has not been in our studies, but other meditation researchers have found also not just increased activation, but increased cortical thickness. So in other words, the area of your brain is actually getting thicker that you're practicing, and that's remarkable. They also performed better on the empathic accuracy test. We're better able to read the emotions of others. We've seen similar things with foster children, and we've seen similar things, increased friendships with elementary school children, as I mentioned. Almost all of this is published. The elementary school children study has not yet been published. So in terms of take-home points, our capacity to care and relate positively to others and the world around us is rooted deeply in our biology and evolutionary history. This is the direction science is going. We can also intentionally cultivate these positive attitudes and emotions through daily practice, even with measurable changes. And these effects then have the potential to positively impact on our relationships. So what I would hope to leave you with is the idea that intentional practice, despite it taking hard work, is worth it. And since it's our very happiness and the happiness of other people around us that's at stake, it's worth putting in the effort and taking some time out of our day, or better yet, infusing it throughout an entire day, these positive values. I just want to mention in closing, we're about to start the Octagon Conference. Actually this evening, we launch it with our opening reception. Last year, the Octagon led to the creation of the Center for Compassion, Integrity, and Secular Ethics, which is a vision of our president, Dr. Riekman, and it was approved by the board in November. We're very excited to have this center. The very purpose of the center, as you can see there, is to engage in research around these positive human values. But importantly, not just the lab-based research that I've been showing you, but connecting that research to other organizations that are out there in the world trying to make a difference. Organizations like Mr. Moore's Children in Crossfire, and also other organizations. One of the most exciting projects that we've just started on is the Shillon Project, which is to bring positive education into prisons for incarcerated persons. And not just any type of education, but education that includes the kind of skills that I've been talking to you about, that we know we can cultivate in young people and in our students. And we're working with the Department of Corrections closely in order to develop this program. We hope to be able to launch it soon, perhaps as early as early next year. So it's a great privilege for me to be here, to be able to share this with you, and also to be part of a community that I believe is doing such exciting and groundbreaking work. So thank you very much.